Seats. It really does give me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Rick Lowe. I'm Nick Lowe, who is chair of the Historic Preservation Department, not to be confused. Most often referenced as the maker and creator of the project Row Houses, which began as a restoration project of around 20 1930s shotgun houses in Houston's 3rd Ward, and that has now grown through an extended series of collaborations and ongoing ripple effects of renovations and restorations across an area of about 10 blocks. It's always interesting to me to understand how such kind of generous, pragmatic gestures can be championed by the art world. Not that the art world's not generous, but there's a way in which sometimes art practices, or the art world takes on practices. As a celebration of a humble architecture from this form, this work has highlighted the histories and experiences that surround such remarkable vernacular structures. And for that alone, this is a remarkable thing. Whether the outcome is understood as historic preservation, as social sculpture, social practice, contextual practice, or public art, it is significant because of the connections that are made between worlds and across registers. As a genuine response to need, Lowe's approach has also been called inspirational and transformative, and that's truly the case. In 2014, he received the MacArthur Genius Fellowship in recognition of his outstanding work. He continues to engage with and inspire communities nationally and internationally, and his work has appeared in many art institutions, including the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, LA MoCA, the Neuberger Museum, Purchase, New York, Phoenix Art Museum, the Gwangju Biennial, Korea, Kumamoto State Museum in Japan, the Venice Architecture Biennale, Documenta 14 in Kassel, and Athens, Greece. Please join me in welcoming Rick Lowe. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I get called that sometimes, but I also get called other variations of Rick, like Dick, and I get Rob Lowe, all that kind of stuff, So anyway, so nice to meet a real Nick. Yeah. Okay. So all right. So tonight I'm gonna kind of give like a survey, I guess, of my approach to work, and I think I'm not going to spend so much time on Project Row Houses, though, because that's something that's out there and folks can kind of, but there are other things that I've been up to that folks may not know about, so I want to spend a little bit more time on that. And but I also want to kind of show like how the cycle of things happen too in this talk a little bit. I will start by I'm gonna when I was preparing this talk, I didn't kind of know how I wanted to approach it because I'm kind of in a new phase. I think I'm doing some things differently, and so I didn't know how to do it. So I had to go back and just kind of start from the beginning for me to contextualize it for myself, right? So if I go back like before Project Row Houses, this is before Project Row Houses. This is like this was kind of my anti-art stage where I was trained as a painter, but was very skeptical of what painting could do in the art world context. So I started to make these things that were, were very direct in terms of the issues that I was after. It was like the material was intended to be kind of impermanent, and so these were things that I would do in conjunction with political rallies and that kind of stuff. I would create, background or backdrops for those kinds of things. This was all this, and of course the slide on the left is reflective of the kind of response that I was getting from that time. Was a making art or making points, and so that was a real kind of I felt I felt the tension around my relevance as an artist, even at this point when I was using somewhat traditional approach, but yeah, it was a little bit of tension around that. But so this is in I think this is from like the early 90s, like 1990 or something like that. And I was trying to be as direct as possible for the issues that I was trying to address. But I actually had a challenge at some point where there was a young student actually challenged me and said that neighborhoods, because this stuff was mostly about what was happening in neighborhoods, and he said, well, neighborhoods didn't need to be told what was happening because they dealt with it every day. They lived with it. So if I was an artist and I was creative, why couldn't I create a solution to it? And so that kind of pulled me back and had me to reconsider. So I shut down my studio practice, and I ventured out into this that became Project Row Houses, which is started in, this says 1994. That was kind of the official opening time, but it actually started a year or so prior to that in terms of conceptualizing. And, it was one of those projects that I had no idea about social and community engagement, but I did know that there was an opportunity before me that could look at transforming something that had real kind of practical implications, but also I could find a way of having some kind of aesthetic frame around it. And this became a journey that has gone on now for over 25 years. And the reason I said I'm kind of shifting a little bit now is that about almost 2 years ago, I decided that, okay, so I think I've carried this project as far as I can as an art project for me, and plus it began to kind of take leaps into the world of development in a way that was kind of putting it more in the middle of things. I work better as an artist on the fringe, on the edge of things, and I felt like the project was beginning to be in the middle of the conversation around, development and stuff. And so it was, and maybe I could go back at some point and nibble at the edges of even Project Row Houses to kind of push it and shake it around a little bit. But this project, it was a slow process of transforming these little shotgun houses into something that people consider the worst place in the neighborhood to being symbolic of what was the best thing about it. And those little shotgun houses were the platform for kind of reimagining, different aspects of how a neighborhood could actually, how this particular neighborhood could grow in the future. And so over time, over the 20 years or so, this is Project Row Houses. This is it. It sits somewhere in the middle of here. And really it's having a pretty profound impact on this area. The leadership there is they're really strong and interesting, but have a very different way of seeing the world and operating than I do. So that's when I kind of realized, like, this is an opportunity for me to step away, because it's an opportunity for this project to have a breath of fresh air, new approaches, new ways. But getting to Project Row Houses, I have to acknowledge these two artists, their impact that they had on me. Joseph Beuys, of course, with his social sculpture and, the way that we shape and mold the world. That was very, very influential for me to think about the possibility of doing something that was deeply important to me, which is activism and community organizing and all that stuff, and to be able to do it as an artistic form, that was really very valuable to me. And this whole notion of everybody being an artist became something that I think is at the core of my work right now. I strive to try to create framework or platforms for that actually to exist, or to help realize that potential. And then the other artist on the right-hand side is John Biggers, who actually gave me an understanding of the context of these little shotgun houses and what they could mean and how they could bring new relevance to historic Black Southern neighborhoods. So that's about all I'm going to do on Project Row Houses. And but now I just want this slide slipped up a little bit, and I had this slide here to talk about the idea of longevity. I mean, like Project Horizon has been going for 25 years, and that was intentional. I didn't know that it would happen, but the goal was to start it and just let it go as long as it could. But I have this one, though. I have this one really especially for Mary Jane Jacob. Because at the time I was starting, Project Row Houses, I had no idea. There weren't very many things that were happening that you could look to. And I heard about this thing that Mary Jane was doing that was called Places with a Past in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was also critical in helping me kind of think about the aesthetics of place in helping shape my thinking about it. But I wanted to show this, though, for her, because she probably hadn't seen this. But this is a piece that she curated, David Hammond's, and that was, I guess it was 1992, or was it 91? And the reason I show it, and I like to use this as examples when I talk to people about temporary work. I mean, this was a temporary piece, and most of those pieces from that time frame were probably there less than a year for sure. But I was just there this last March, and I made I had seen it at some point some years ago, but I thought, I wonder what that David Hammond's piece is doing. And I made my way there, and to my surprise, it's still there. It's still gorgeous. It's still beautiful in that community. So I mean, to me, that's the testament of. It's a strong testament of this piece and its power, to galvanize community, because I think that whole community now is kind of, moving around it. And also, actually going to visit it this time too, it was something else that kind of hit me too. I've never really thought about the title of this piece, but the title of it was 44 America. And then, and in this photos over here are like little young boys looking to the flag, which has the African colors. But then down here, there's a plaque somewhere that talks about, where's the vision for America going to come from, whatever. And then I started thinking, number 44, that's Obama. Is that like so I would, if anybody see David, tell him I got it, finally. So anyway, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about another project, though. And what I would do with these, my projects in general, is, well, sometimes they happen from inside cultural institutions, and sometimes outside. So Project Row Houses was something that just kind of bubbled up from an outside initiative. But this project, TRANS.LATION VICKERY MEADOW, is a project that is in Dallas, and it started as a part of the Nasher Sculpture Center 10th anniversary exhibition. They actually wanted 10 different artists to kind of do sculpture that was not in the museum, but somewhere out around the city. And they invited me to kind of do a piece under the guise of social sculpture. And so when I went there, they had a number of different locations for me to consider. But the one that caught my attention in the beginning, it wasn't very interesting for me, because it was a kind of a 1970s style suburban apartment complex area. All this blue area over here is all like apartment complexes. I mean, I think the number was something, at the high point, it was something like 50,000 units of housing in this area, and it's just densely populated with apartments. But at that time in the 1970s, when it was built, with these it was like built for these kind of like hip, like young college grads to, they get their home there, and it was all about this idea of like the pool houses and the apartment club houses and that kind of stuff. And it was really designed, kind of as a place for young people to go, but they still have parents that they kind of do things where they drive their cars to the supermarkets and the malls and that kind of stuff. And it was a particular kind of lifestyle that was really, big, I guess, in the 70s into the 80s. And but like most places, after depreciation of properties, the value go down. And so this place, it started to kind of go down a bit. And so by the time that I went to visit in 2000, 2012, this neighborhood, the identity as being a hip, cool place to be, it kind of shifted. And the identity was one of violence and crime, and it was kind of interesting. But I always, when I approach projects, I always try to find something that's a little bit contradictory or something, and I can kind of seek to tease that out. So with this one, it was this idea of that it had been like considered one of the better places in the city and the hip place to be, but then all of a sudden it was considered later at this time one of the worst places because it was so violent. But when I went to the neighborhood and I could see the population of people that were occupied in the neighborhood, it kind of struck me, this notion that we in America, we talk about the value of diversity. And I was like, okay, so this is one of the most diverse places I've ever seen. So why is it the worst place? So why is that contradiction? What's there? And so that's the thing that kind of got my interest there, and I kind of started to explore that. And Ezra, for your students, I can just give them a clue on. Ezra is teaching a class. She gave her students some papers notes, some clues to look for about my process. I like walking the streets. I like talking to people. I do all kinds of, from the individual talking to people to, group meetings. That's kind of how I tease things out. So the students won't have to work for that answer. Okay. Anyway, so that's kind of, generally what I started. Then I always try to recruit people within a local context to work with me, because I understand the challenges around being considered an outsider, and I embrace that. I never try to refute the fact that I'm an outsider. I hold that, and I try to leverage that, though, to be able to connect with other people who are insiders that could work with me. And so on the lower left is a team of folks that Dallas artists and others that were helping me kind of walk through the streets and talk to people. And then, but it wasn't until I went to this particular thing, at the top, it was a meeting where there was a group of folks that were going against the current. The city and everybody was trying to say that you needed to police the neighborhood more because there was so much crime. But these folks said, well, maybe there's another reason for this crime. And they said, well, maybe it's because people don't know each other. There are all these immigrants and refugees. I forgot to say, the reason that kind of diversity was there was because in the early 2000s, because this neighborhood had so many apartments and it was cheap because it was kind of going down, it was a perfect place for the International Refugee Committee and Catholic Charities to place refugees. So they were being placed there by the thousands, and they were from all over the place. They didn't know each other. It was this group of women said maybe the problem is people don't know each other. So let's host a lunch, and they start hosting something they call the Mom's Lunch, in which they would have anywhere from 4 to 5 women from 4 or 5 different countries, and they would get together and they'd share stories and they'd talk. And I asked them if I could come. They allowed me to come and sit in the back and listen in. And the stories were so amazing, and I just thought if people could have this experience and could see this, it would really open up a different kind of possibility. So I thought, how do you bring that kind of cross-cultural communication together without it exploiting the people? Because this is a kind of a secure space for these women, so you can't open that up. But as I walked the streets, I also noticed there were people that were trying to do things that were customary where they came from, and that's being like they're in a market. They're trying to sell things. That's how they kind of do things. So I came up with this idea of thinking, well, what if we tried to do a market in this neighborhood and encourage people to come out and bring their things all together and sell. But nobody could quite understand what that meant. So we started going to different meetings and talking to people until we kind of figured the best way to do it was to actually set up a place for workshops to teach people how to make things for a market, and then we would actually do the market. But actually, after, we had a few apartments in an apartment complex in the middle of the neighborhood. And after a few week sessions, we found that there were people who were coming to the workshops that were very capable of teaching workshops themselves. So we kind of opened it up for them, and they started, teaching workshops and doing all this stuff. And so then we got to the point that we would test the market, and the responses were challenging, right? The social service agencies that work with the refugees and immigrants said it's not going to work because people are too afraid to go out. They're not going to want to do it. The folks at the museum were definitely scared. They were like, our people are not going to go to Vickery MEADOW. It's like, no way. And so, but we forged on, and we had this place. Also, we strategically chose this apartment complex that had this big tree in the front courtyard near the street, and partly I was attracted to the tree, but the other part too was that it was kind of known as the worst place because that was called the drug tree. That's where the drug dealers would come, and because they could stash their drugs in the rotten hole on one side of the tree. And so I was like, if we could just kind of reclaim this in a way, that would be something beneficial for the neighborhood. So we decided, okay, so let's do this market thing around the tree, and we organized it around food. Originally thinking that, we're lucky if we can get 4 or 5 different groups or something. But we did this first market, and it just kind of, it was really amazing to see, the folks kind of moving into this site from around the neighborhood. In fact, one of the things I remember that was really moving about this was that there was one young African-American guy, as we were, setting up and getting things going, he came by and he was going like, he was very gangster with his, kind of gang group, and was saying some pretty harsh things to us, and basically kind of threatened to come back and just set up his drug table, that he would sell drugs there. And we're like, no, it's not a good idea. But we did the thing, and it was such a beautiful, special moment. And that night, as we were cleaning up, somebody knocked at the door, and it was like this same young man had come back, but this time he came back and he had his shirt on, and he was all buttoned up, and he came back and he was like, who are you guys, and what are y'all doing? He's like, nobody's ever done anything like this in our neighborhood. And like, why are you doing it? What do you do? And from that point forward, he became one of our people that was instrumental in kind of helping us move things forward. As were one of my people here, I had to put this slide in because she's in the audience. She was like a baby when she was there. Erica Sadoff was. Her mother was one of our key artists that were working with us, and she would just tag along. And here she is now. She's at the School of the Art Institute studying architecture. So, but what was really, cool about that time frame was that behind these men standing here, these guys here, this is the drug tree. All of a sudden, this drug tree location had been transformed into this place where, there are people doing music, there are, board games being played, workshops being happening inside the apartments looking out, and then this is our stage that we ended up doing that I'm going to show you next. When we wanted to continue, we were doing these things every month, and we had to expand them, so we decided, actually it was that young man that first accused us of not knowing what we were doing and was critical of it. He suggested that the next one we should do a talent show. And so we ended up making this goofy flyer with all the different languages that we could find from people in the neighborhood, so people all felt that they were connected. And like the typical kinds of things, we said, well, aim low and be pleasantly surprised, and trying to, go high and be disappointed. And but we were thinking, if for this talent show, if we got, 10 or so people to participate, it would be really good. But once again, like the food thing, it surprised us, and it just grew, and it was more. We had, we were planning for the event to go for like 3 hours. It ended up going for like almost 5 hours. There were like almost 30 performers. The performers were everybody from like a 86-year-old white man doing the hokey pokey to, a 4-year-old little Somalia girl doing a traditional dance, and all the things in between, from gospel, hip hop, mariachi, and all kinds of. It was, and what was really interesting about it was having all those folks having to kind of hang around and watch the others perform as they're waiting for their culture to go up. So it was this kind of cross-cultural exchange that was pretty amazing. But one of the things that happened during this time, I'm noticing in this presentation, I don't have the slide of an image of a Mark Bradford exhibition at White Cube. You know, as we were doing these markets, we realized there were artists who were displaced artists from their home countries, and they were artists that deserved some place to show their work beyond these, at a market kind of thing, on tables and stuff. And when I was talking to Mark was talking about how, you know, this idea of White Cube as being something that kind of really positioned the value of work in a sense, and I think it was around that time, like some of his work was going to like hit the $1 million mark or something like that, and I was like, holy shit! I was like, we need white cubes in Dallas, you know. So I had this idea. I was thinking, how do you do that? You know, so I went back to Dallas and I talked to a group of architects and I said, I need a white cube gallery. I need white cubes. Can you give me white cubes? And so they took on the challenge, and they came back with these designs that turned out to be really interesting. These little cube spaces. So at this point now in the project, we were able to expand from just the the apartments in the big tree to like going up and down the street with these little white cube galleries that were interesting because we were able to show the work of artists that had things that they want, that deserved a little better attention than the market idea. But they also served as like bus stops and that kind of stuff, so people could get out of the rain and stuff. So it was like this multi-purpose. And also, this neighborhood was not designed for people on the streets. So there were no amenities along the street. So all of a sudden, this became like points of interest for people to kind of move up and down the street. And we just curated different kinds of exhibitions in these spaces. From young people, older people, kind of more classical people, to people doing installation work. And then all of a sudden, it became like the place where people would kind of organize things around the white cubes. The white cubes became the gathering place for kind of cultural exploration. And that project continued. It was for the exhibition of the Nasher, but it actually ended up going for 5 years. It went from it actually opened in 2013, and it went through 2018. And a good chunk of this was through this part of it, with all this kind of programming of like training people for things like getting their catering certificates and license and stuff, English classes, also classes around sexual abuse and all that kind of stuff. It was like this hub for taking care of that particular community there, and it was led by this artist Carol Zhu, who kind of led it through that stage. Now that particular project led to this thing with Documenta. It started to help me kind of understand. It prepared me really for Documenta, because when I was invited to participate in Documenta, it was just after I had gone to Greece for the first time in June of 2015, and June of 2015 was an incredible year for Greece. I mean, there were so many things going on there. I mean, there was the there was the run of the banks. There was the referendum whether they would leave the EU. The borders were opened up, so there were refugees coming from all over. And I just happened to be there that June, unrelated to Documenta, not knowing about Documenta, but I was there for something else. And then when I went there, the energy was just insane. And I was like, oh my God, this place could like explode at any time. And but then a few months later, I was asked by Documenta if I would do something. So I thought, and by the way, Documenta happens in Kassel, Germany, but the director decided he would split it between Kassel, Germany, and Athens, Greece, and which and they took me to Athens first, and I'm really glad they did, because I I'll talk about Kassel a little bit, but it didn't really resonate with me like the issue in Athens did. I was very curious about this notion of the refugees and immigrants and the whole like turmoil that was happening there. And as I looked, I just got deeper into it, right? Because these were the kind of images you were seeing of people coming in, trying to get to camps and so on and so forth. But one of the things that was also happening was that there was a neighborhood just north of the central of Athens called Victoria Square, and it was beginning to turn into a refugee camp itself, but it was just a traditional kind of Greek square. But all of a sudden, the folks were having to deal with this kind of huge influx of people basically living there, sleeping on the streets. And you can imagine, what happens in a situation like that. There are no restrooms, and so that fed into another dynamic that was happening in Greece. You had business owners and folks that were already kind of freaking out about the economic circumstance, and so they were really upset with this situation with the refugees occupying this square, and it was also during the time of the rise of this the fascist party, the Golden Dawn, who apparently while some people in Greece were going out to Athens was going out to feed and clothe people, but the Golden Dawn was coming out at night beating people up. So it was like this weird tension, and then there was a sense that most of the business owners were leaning toward the Golden Dawn, and so all the owners, the store owners, did this campaign where this is a sign that you always see when something is for sale, and so every business owner around the square agreed to putting up these signs to say they were for sale, because that was their way of putting pressure on the mayor to deal with that situation, so that they could go back to doing their business, and so they did move people out of the square for the most part, at least from camping there, and folks would come during the daytime. But I was really fascinated with that square and the opportunity that it had to kind of be symbolic of how this crisis should be dealt with, and the relationship between the Greek natives, the refugees, and the immigrants too, because the immigrants were caught into this too, because the Greek natives didn't distinguish between refugees and immigrants. And then immigrants were upset with the refugees because they were being lumped into, so it was a real complicated triangle there. But as I continued to kind of meet with folks and talk to folks, there was some clarity that started to happen. I started to explore this square, and what, just kind of looking at what were the resources, what were people doing around it. The square is here. And just kind of trying to understand it and looking at these businesses that had all participated in this anti-immigrant situation, and then I wanted to have a space that could kind of challenge people to kind of address this issue, and the common thinking would have been to do it on the square because that's where all the action was. But my sensibility around that was like the square is the wrong place; it should be off the square somewhere. So what I ended up doing was, so this is Victoria Square. There's a train station that comes up right in the middle of the square. And so what I would do daily, I would go and I would sit there and watch people as they get out of the train. Where do they go? So I would watch, these are the main streets here going north. And so I would just watch, and I would notice how so many people would get out and they would come through and they would take this little narrow street here. And then it would go down and turn to get back on the main street. And that's because the streets are pretty terrible in Athens. So I started walking that street. And then one day I noticed this building here, and I thought, this might be, the location, because it's off the square, and this is a mostly pedestrian street. And there are a few cars every once in a while, but it's designed mostly, it's been limited mostly to pedestrians and for people delivering stuff mainly. And what was also key was it had these big windows, that was key because you did not find kind of things that were dealing with refugees or immigrants. I found in all my research on the first floor. Everything was like the second floor and above. And as I started to question that I found out that one of the reasons for that was that a lot of the services that were provided for refugees and immigrants were like health issues, legal issues, and that kind of stuff. So there was no real reason for a public presence, but what it signified, though, that nobody was dealing with issues of culture. And so as an entity trying to deal with culture, then we needed that kind of public presence. And so this was the place I targeted. I figured, we'd clean these windows up and like clean the space up, and that would be the platform. And also in my mind, thinking about the street too as being important. So working with local artists and folks to kind of help, figure out, the design and getting the space ready. And also, if you take note here, I'm playing dominoes here, which I'll get with that a little bit more. But anyway, so this space, after a bit of time of getting it together and starting to activate it, it has truly become kind of the living room space of this neighborhood, which is actually kind of projecting out into the entirety of the city, and symbolically as a great symbolic representation of how this kind of cross-cultural conflict could be managed. And so this thing, it's still going today. It opened in 2017. Was it January 2017? And then it just continues to go. But then we were paying attention to the business owners too, because they were kind of silent in the back, and we had to figure out how do we rope these folks in. Small business owners don't do group stuff and all that stuff, so we said we have to go to them. We have to figure out a framework for them. So we generated this newspaper called One to One, and each week we would produce these newspapers, pairing different store owners with others. And that was interesting and telling too, because there were certain store owners in the beginning that would not want to participate if they were placed next to an immigrant business, or something like that. It was this whole kind of weird dynamic that was happening. But ultimately, these are all businesses that participated, in this this campaign. And then the street, as I said, the street became a part of it to activate, doing workshops and performances and some traditional stuff, some from different countries. This is Georgian. It's like this was I think mostly Africa night at the top, and traditional Greek at the bottom, and then exhibition space. So in that space, we have ground floor, and then we have a second floor that has exhibition space that we do, exhibition kinds of things, but also working. But the key though with this project though was not just to generate activity, but to be able to figure out how you can glean stuff from that to elevate the understanding of the value of conscious engagement around the future of a particular community. And so, this place has become a lab for planners and architects that are interested in moving this agenda forward. And then it, the ultimate goal is to kind of create a political platform for this neighborhood. And this is kind of the project that's made it to this pinnacle, which I'm totally amazed at how it's kind of moved in this way. I should also go back and say that one of the early collaborators I found was this woman, Maria Papadimitriou, who was she represented Greece in the Venice Biennale in 2015. And so with her on the project, she had the kind of understanding of the Greek dynamic to be able to help work stuff. But this project has slowly worked to this point where it's the place where everybody looks to in terms of trying to deal with the politics of this. So when the mayor wanted to have the citizens group were trying to find a place to host a mayor's forum about the conditions of neighborhoods, they chose Victoria Square Project, in which these are the mayoral candidates. And this is a day. It's just a mayor's forum outside, and then there's a very strange thing that also happened in this context. There was a woman I met in Germany. I was doing a talk, and she heard me talk about this project, and she said, "Oh, I'm from Greece. We should meet." And I met her. Her name is Alexandra Misataki. I didn't know it at the time, but I realized when she did come to visit the project that she was the daughter of a former prime minister, and I also realized that her I was told that her brother was the head of the centrist party in the government at that particular time, and her sister was the Secretary of Commerce. So they're like so she's deeply rooted in the political world. And then when the mayor's race came about, her nephew was also running for mayor. So since that time, though, he's become mayor. Her nephew has become mayor, and this is her brother, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who is now the prime minister. And so, so now this project has this kind of it's angled within the Greek politics there, which Alexandria, and it's really interesting in the context of Alexandria because she's trying to push something that's called the World Human Forum. And so for her, this whole notion of how you deal with the kind of refugee and immigrant situation is critical to that. And so Victoria Square project has become the center of that. So that's Athens and Victoria Square project. But also, so when I was invited though on this for Documenta, they wanted the artists to do something in both Kassel and in Athens. Now, what I just showed you was like a lot of energy. It took a lot of energy and time to move that, and resources. I mean, I wasn't living there. I would go there, every 6 weeks or so, and so basically, in terms of time, I didn't have time or energy around a Kassel project. I had no budget for it. So, but they were determined and they were insistent that each artist had some present there. So, the only thing that I found that was remotely interesting to me was this woman introduced me to a movement that had been going on for some time to rename one of the main streets going through Kassel after this person, Halat, who had been killed by a neo-Nazi group some years prior. And they had been trying to get this street renamed, but they were met with kind of aggressive resistance from the municipality. And so I thought, I don't have resources, but this is at least kind of interesting. So I ended up looking at the map for the Athens Documenta, and I thought it was an interesting map. And I started doing something. Normally, I don't work in these kind of subversive ways so often, but I didn't have resources, so I had to kind of figure something out. And I thought, well, they won't rename the street. But what if we, since Documenta was going to produce, they said, 1 million maps for Kassel, said maybe we could rename the street on the map for the millions of hands that would touch this thing. I wouldn't have to have any money, no budget, no whatever. I just have an idea. Let's do it. But then I had to kind of figure out how to frame it a little bit broader. And I see Abigail's looking like, what? Because nobody ever knew about this happening in Kassel, right? It was something that was kind of under the radar, and that's kind of why I decided to talk about it tonight, because I haven't, and I should talk about it because it's something that happened there, but hardly anybody would know about it. But so what I figured, though, since there was such resistance to renaming this particular street because of the politics of it, I thought maybe we could diffuse it a little bit by making it a part of a renaming process to think about other places that have problematic names. And so this woman, she took me to this place, and she wanted to show me this, which it was really funny. She said, this bridge was named after this guy, Karl Brenner Brook, whatever, who was he was very active in the Nazi party. And they've named this bridge after him. And she's like, it's terrible. It should be renamed. And she said, and they know there's something wrong with it, because even when they put up the sign about the history, they put it up so high. Like, who's going to read that? I mean, she's like, so there's something wrong with this thing. So anyway, so I said, okay, so let's kind of play with this a little. So if Documenta is going to do these maps, and they're usually black and white, whatever, maybe they can have one page of it that is, black with, highlighting the street part, and then in this part it says Halat Street, formerly known as Holland Street, right? That's the name of the street. And then this one is I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but it was formerly the Karl Brucker Street or whatever. Bridge. And the idea was like, okay, so we've got this kind of explanation point happening here, and because originally we talked to them and we said we wanted to do it on their map, but we wanted to do it red. But we got a response that they said, after a while they said, well, red, we don't have the budget for that. It's too, the color thing. But the other thing was I was very cautious with the Documenta team. I said, we probably shouldn't talk about this before we do it. Let's get the things printed first because, the mayor's, City Hall might respond to this if it gets out. And so, I don't know, maybe it got out because then they said, okay, we can't do the red, so we supplied this black, and then they said, no, not the black. So then we tried white, it's like this is close to what you still, and this could work, and then they said, no, we can't do the black line like that, whatever. And then we got into a negotiation about how it could exist. And this is what we came down to. Like they sent me back and they said, okay, so this is it. And I said, well, can we actually make the line thicker to accent it more? And then they sent me this one. And they said, okay, so it's accented more. I was like, well, okay, this is not going anywhere. And I didn't, and it was just, too much effort. And it wasn't I didn't want to put my energy in it. But for whomever goes through the archives of Documenta will find this. That street is renamed on all the Documenta maps that went out at that time. So it's there, but it's kind of not known. But anyway, I wasn't worried so much about that because I had the Athens things going, and plus I had dominoes. Dominoes is what I do. I play dominoes. It's a big part of my practice. It's how I come together with people, and I try to. One of the things that I try to do in my practice is to. Ezra, she's a domino player too. She's sat at my domino table before, but I try to listen to the things that I'm really drawn to and try to see where it will take me. I spent 20-something years playing dominoes, and not because so much I liked dominoes, but there was something about the social dynamics of it. But then I also started noticing there was something else that was interesting about it to me, and it was the patterns of what happens when you play dominoes. And I play dominoes so much, and I'm just watching these patterns, and I start to keep score on paper. If you're playing on a nice table, you put some paper down, and you can keep score there. And then at a certain point, I started to try to wait. Is that okay? Yeah, I started trying to to figure out the patterns, as the games would go, and then they kind of led to these things that were more drawings, and and I wasn't really certain why this was important to me, except I started to realize that there was something happening that, I was so intensely involved in social and community engagement for so many years that this idea and this notion of stepping back into and claiming a silent space for myself began to be something that was really interesting for me. And these drawings were kind of doing that, right? And I kept doing it, and then they just kept getting a little bit bigger and more elaborate, so they kind of kept going until, at a certain point, I kind of realized that I was back into a studio practice of, making these drawings and paintings around this kind of domino thing, right? But I still didn't quite know, what I was really trying to do with it. But then a couple of things happened. I ended up doing this this set, which started to kind of teach me some things about my interest in social and community engagement. In playing dominoes, I'm sure there are many different ways to play, but I play a couple of different ways. There's, in the South, the way that we play, it's mostly, there's a cross. You can play 4 different ways. And so things go off in, 4 different ways, which can get kind of a little chaotic a little bit. And then there's a way that, South Americans play, and even in parts of, and actually this is the way they play in Greece, where they just play in a straight line. And so I thought, I ended up doing, this piece because I was doing it based on this kind of 4-way thing, and it was very fluid and very complex and very, improvisational. And then I started doing, I said, well, what would happen if I do them like in the singular kinds of thing? And what it started to read to me was something that was like, one reads much more, improvisational, and the other read much more as kind of more of a rational, kind of structured thing. And I started thinking about how, in my work, what I'm doing a lot of is trying to negotiate this thing between economically under-resourced places and economically over-resourced places. Under-resourced places have a tendency to be much more much more improvisational, and the others they become very planned and very speculative. And then I started to realize that in these works, where you start to kind of see the interaction and interconnection of this kind of play on, like, this speculative notion of order and linear way of thinking and operating in the midst of other places where it's this kind of chaotic notion of how to sustain. So doing that kind of work has kind of given me this opportunity to kind of do something that I hadn't had an opportunity to do in a long time, which was to be more kind of reflective about what this whole thing I'm involved in on a daily basis, to be able to step back and reflect on it, which then led me to the next project. I have just a little bit more here. The project two projects that I'm currently engaged in, and they're both somewhat connected to this idea of Wall Street. Everybody kind of know, and Wall Street is one of those kind of over-resourced places that's about speculation and that kind of stuff. But it's all about big money. People kind of talk about how it's powerful, right? It's also bullish. There's this sense that Wall Street is that kind of power. But what a lot of people don't know is that there is another kind of way of Wall Street that's not so much about that kind of speculative thing, but it's about improvisation and survival, and how do you kind of take what you have and you move it around and you shift things. And this came to my attention through the efforts of a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood, that was the home of one of the what was called Black Wall Street neighborhoods. Black Wall Street basically connoting that there are economic opportunities for black people, and there were places like that around the country. But and they were, as I said, they were called Black Wall Street because of the economic vitality. This is in the early 1900s. So I'm currently working on a project that's called the Greenwood Art Project, and because there's a centennial that Greenwood is dealing with. That centennial is connected to kind of the remembrance of the great economic presence of the Greenwood neighborhood nationally, and how people migrated there because of economic opportunity, but came to a sudden halt in 1921 as the ban of KKK and other white citizens decided that this 35-block neighborhood of 11,000 people should be burned to the ground. And they kind of lined themselves up in kind of military forms, and they just went through the neighborhood and burned it to the ground. Some officially, 300 people were killed, but 11,000 were, displaced. But that number of dead has been disputed, and they're now finally exploring, the mass graves that people have been talking about for the longest time. And so places like that majestic Williams Theater, this was it, doing this this massacre. But what's interesting about the Tulsa massacre, is what they called it, was that it was burned to the ground. But strangely enough, the people of Tulsa, the black people of Tulsa, came back and they rebuilt this Black Wall Street bigger and better than it was prior to the massacre, which was pretty amazing. I mean, to be able to think about that, right? For 11,000 people to be burned to the ground, their homes, their businesses, everything, and for them to go back, and there's a building, this building right here, I mean, you can't really see it, but at the head up here, it says 1922, which is amazing that a year after it was burned, they rebuilt that quickly. And to me, there was a certain kind of spirit that represented, that I wanted to know where that is, because it's not in Tulsa now, because Tulsa survived the massacre. This is like a map from prior to the massacre, and this is it now, with a highway that have gone through and just wrecked all of it. This is let me see. There's one. Okay, this little spot here. Yeah, this little spot here is this spot here, and so the highway destroyed all of this, and then they continued to get rid of all of these businesses and homes to basically put parking lots with a branch of a school that's not even used. So I'm doing this project there, basically working with artists there to help kind of generate an opportunity for that conversation to happen, because the conversation around what happened there in Tulsa has not been had with the Tulsans at all. And there are interesting ideas coming up. One of the most empowering ones that I've heard so far is somebody that wants to do a play, a theatrical piece, that puts forth the trial that never happened. There was never a trial that happened accusing anyone of this massacre. But what they did do, though, the city did blame someone, and they blamed someone by the name of J.B. Stratford, who was one of the wealthiest people in the Greenwood neighborhood, and he was attributed to being the founder of Black Wall Street, as he moved there in, I think, 1898, and bought land, encouraged other people to come. And as I left there thinking, having this question, said, okay, so we can deal with the Tulsa conversation about the massacre, but I'm interested in what does Black Wall Street look like in the 21st century? How do we find that, and what does that mean? So I started to search around, and there was a young woman that I had met a few years ago, and she was at Stanford Business School, and I thought I needed to talk to someone, young, business-minded person, and I contacted this woman, and she said that her great-grandfather was J.B. Stratford, who started Black Wall Street. It was just happened it was a coincidence that happened. And then come to find out that, she's from Chicago. And so J.B. Stratford escaped Oklahoma and came to Chicago after he was, he skipped bail. He got out in Tulsa and he skipped the state because he knew that he was probably up for lynching. And so he came here, and his successful career, and his children are successful. And and then I started to look at Chicago and think about the possibility of Chicago as being a place to look at and explore this possibility of what Black Wall Street could look like in the 21st century. Now, I don't have a lot to say about this project because it was still in the formative stages of it, and early kind of thinking. But I will say this, that when I started with Project Row Houses, this was like the very first flyer for Project Row Houses. I mean, I just, it was just a hand-drawn, like, let's just draw it up and Xerox it out. But I've been coming here and working with Abigail Winograd and Michael and other folks at the Smart Museum, where that's going to produce this an exhibition that I'm doing this project as a part of, and there's no material around this. So I just thought, okay, well, let me just go back and let me do my Project Row Houses thing. This is one idea of something that I thought, okay, this is an idea that we're playing around with for the one part of Black Wall Street. It's called the Black Wall Street Journey, and the idea is to be able to look at Chicago as a place that we can talk about this journey, both from a standpoint of in terms of information, what information is out there that's about the economic conditions of Black people in Chicago, and also even nationally. And so I had this idea of kind of creating a place that could be symbolic of what a Black Wall Street would look like, the entire neighborhood, but just taking one building. So just imagining this building. This is the old Schultz Bakery, Bacon Company building, and imagining that building, if it had like high-level investment firms, high-level tech firms, along with barbershops, restaurants or whatever, just retail, but also, so kind of bringing together this idea of high margin and low margin business within the same context, because that's what is representative of what the old Black Wall Street was all about. There was, right now, it's, you can't really, you can't even find like kind of higher end retail stuff in Black neighborhoods and stuff. So there's a complete separation in a sense. So this thing is kind of to be able to reflect that symbolically. But also, the idea was that also we collect a lot of information, and how do we put that information out? And because I was reading something, and they were talking about African Americans' contribution to the economy, and they were saying like however many $1 billion in a particular year, and I thought, what would that look like if you said it in a month? How granular can you get it? Can you get it to a month? Can you get it from a month to a week? Can you get it from a week to a day? Can you get it like by the hour? What's the economic, in the sense of Wall Street, right? I mean, because Wall Street, you can get it by the second, right? I mean, Wall Street is ticking all the time. So the idea is like, how can we, take information? So this little image here kind of represents the notion of what would happen if you could put these ticker things on a building, and you could actually have it just kind of rotate throughout the day for the people that are moving through the south side of Chicago, kind of reflecting this notion of what, Black Wall Street or the economic conditions of a Black neighborhood. So that's where I'll leave you. Thank you. Oh, am I supposed to say any questions? Any questions? Yes.
I just have a question on how you start these major projects, and how you approach financially, how you get sponsors, and how you get connections to gather people to start these projects. I'm just wondering.
Well, I mean, every situation is different. Sometimes it's an advantage to have institutions within a place that can help kind of, pave the road for, whether it's financially or connecting to community and that kind of stuff. But sometimes those are liabilities too, right? I mean, for instance, in the case with Documenta in Greece, it was definitely a liability for me. I mean, there were, people that would not. I mean, because Athens has a large anarchist movement, and people are, and so they don't trust institutions. So my project, even though it was supposed to be, deeply rooted within the community, they wouldn't touch it because they said, it's institution, there's institutional backing in some way, and so in that situation, I had to rely much more heavily on the network of artists that I could meet, and as far as funding, one of the things I would say I generally try not to think about projects from a funding standpoint, a financial standpoint. I try to think about it more from a perspective of resource. What resources are available, and funding money is just one resource. I mean, there could be many others, right? And I kind of navigate from there of trying to figure out, where there are financial resources, but also where there are other resources that can sustain a project before long. I can just tell you though, with Project Row Houses, that project operated for, the cleanup, the first kind of physical exhibition kind of things. It was called a drive-by exhibition, that kind of stuff. All this stuff for about a year happened with no money. I mean, just basically people showing up and, throwing in, 10, 15, 20 bucks here and there, and we were able to just kind of resource everything we needed. And then it started to garner, yeah.
What's up? Being that like most of your work is reliant on community outreach, how much of it is about like perseverance within yourself, and like how do you stay motivated through all of that?
Yeah.
Like I see like there's like Greenpeace, for example, a lot of their work is community outreach, so staying on a corner and waiting for people to pass by and like trying to communicate, and the amount of people that just walk past without even like, oh, what's up? You know what I'm saying? How do you like keep going through that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say, I just to help you with terminology, I would never use the outreach term. I mean, it's much more engagement. It's community engagement, because you're really trying to, find a way to communicate and be in communication with people, as opposed to, outreach is more of something that you have an agenda with them, and folks get really kind of skeptical of that. But figuring out how to engage them, and so I play dominoes. That's my, and I'll play some basketball too if somebody want to challenge me. I do that kind. I like to do things what people do on a normal basis. You don't have to start with this idea of the art agenda. But I would also say though that, I kind of picked this up from an old rock climber named Todd Skinner, who unfortunately passed away, who climbed like incredible mountains. But he had this, I went to a lecture that he gave, this was years ago, like when I was before Project Row Houses, and he talked about the importance of having the proper people around you, and for him, like having somebody that could keep you laughing, that can kind of keep you kind of going and keep your energy. So you have to find, because there definitely, there are situations where you just feel like, this is not working, and I can, yeah. And even, just kind of the exploratory part of the Black Wall Street journey here in Chicago. I mean, we've met like some interesting kind of, I would say that, for me, and at certain times, they're kind of downers. It's like, what's going on with this? But there are people around. This artist Amanda Williams, every time she steps into a room, and we talk about this project, it's like immediately brings life back to it. And then I have, Abigail has been very steady, of not allowing to get caught into the, as the person who's kind of dreaming it up, you have a tendency to invest a lot of emotions into it. But other people can kind of keep you balanced, and that becomes really important.
In a sense, for asking, so when you actually, for example, like doing a process from in a photography standpoint, like trying to capture an imagination or something realistically from A to Z, when you work with materials for doing resourcing for materials or resourcing for stuff, like when you do dominoes, how that inspire a process or a set of processes for you? And
give me one more chance at that. Yeah, state it one more time. Let me see if I really got it.
How, well, in a shorter perspective, how do you gather that material to keep that project going forward or keep that notion?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the way that I work, of those kind of two ways I was talking about the painting, one being much more improvisational, one being much more strategic and planned. My nature is to be improvisational, right? And so my thing is to constantly try to read the situation, and reading where the opportunity is and where the pitfalls might be, and trying to navigate, around that. And I don't try to, avoid or run from the pitfalls, but I don't think I can get energy from the pitfalls to actually do the work. I need to be aware of them. So that's a big part of it, is being able to balance that. How do you maintain a kind of openness and awareness to critique or opposition or whatever, but at the same time, finding ways to connect to things that have some energy that you can build upon and to keep going.
Would you say that your work is non-utopian in that it doesn't seek to pre-prescribe? You said that that you do a lot of things improvisationally, and in that sense, would you say that it is non-utopian because it doesn't seek to predefine the means to its ends?
Yeah, I would agree with that, in that I don't try to define what the destination is and try to get to that destination. And as I get older and I kind of start to think about how life works, to me, the notion of solving the problem is a little bit problematic in a sense, and it's a little bit arrogant too, to think about that. If you think of how many people have come before us, and we have pretty much so similar problems, a lot, so this idea that I can solve the problem, but what I am interested in is living a meaningful life, right? And trying to find ways through which you can find something that has purpose for you, and you can work toward that. Now, how that ends up, what kind of result that is, during your lifetime, who knows? But the point is to do the meaningful work, and allow the results of the outcomes to be what the world order will kind of position them to be.
Hi, so how do you make sure that these projects survive after you move on? And do you feel the need to keep nurturing them, or to just let them stand on their own?
Oh boy. That come all the way from Vickery, MEADOW? No. So that's a very interesting question, because as I've said, I go into a project thinking that it has, or framing it in a way that, it could live, it could continue to live, and the way that I think that there's a possibility of projects to live and to grow and to continue is to create platforms for new and interesting energy to come into it, and how you can kind of, set it up so that happens. And sometimes it happens in ways that it can go. I think that Project Row Houses is an example of that. I mean, it has a certain kind of energy in it now that it'll just keep going. It's not going to go the way that I would do it at all, but that's not the important. That's that whole thing about judging what the outcome should be. I'm not going to do that in that situation. And so it's really about investing in other people, in that belief that other people have, that their voice can be as viable as mine, and as you can, kind of set that up where that can go, continuously, then that's great. Now, I will say this, though. I have, and I won't talk specifically about it, but I have had one situation in which I feel like there was a certain level of, immaturity at the time that I didn't take care of the work that I left behind, and it ended up, in my view, actually kind of ultimately doing more harm than good, in that situation. And so that was a learning thing for me to know that while I do believe in and push for this idea of creating space for others to go through, sometimes there is a need to stay engaged a little longer, which I didn't. So. Yep.
I'm curious, I was interested in asking, when you're making proposals or talking to institutions about these ideas, how do you negotiate that kind of slipperiness of outcomes, or when it's not specific, what is that kind of approach or proposal when you're talking to institutions and making that ask?
I think I kind of try to find a position that I can reflect on of the value that I want to bring to the project. I mean, there's a particular value that I want to bring to this Black Wall Street Journey thing. I don't know what it is. I mean, but there's a particular kind of value, and that's what I'm selling. I'm trying to sell this idea that there's a particular kind of value that there's an opportunity for, and this concept is a framework for that value. And try to stay true to that until there are things that start to manifest itself that people can kind of attach themselves to and start to see it. But and so I try to stay as broad as possible. Now that's challenging though when you start trying to find resources and stuff, because in general, kind of keeping it open that way. The openness is so that people have access to the project and they can actually engage and really be a part of shaping it. But the truth of the matter is, most people don't want that. Most people want to be told their role. They want to know, what is it and what do you want me to do? And and in my case, most of the time I'm saying, I don't know what it is. What I do know is that there is this concept and this framework, and I need you to help kind of shape it and figure it. And that's a tough one for a lot of people.
I'm glad we got there, so I could ask you, who are you talking to so far, and what kind of feedback are you getting on the latest project?
In here in Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I I don't, it's so funny. I can't remember how I started connecting to some of the artists that I've been, connected to, but, Amanda Williams and Fahim Majid, folks like that I've been, connecting with as artists. And then what I kind of feel like the art side of it is something that can kind of be teased out and that can kind of work itself. But there's another side of it though, this project is going to need for it to reach any kind of level of accomplishment and that is like the business community from the high end side, right? I mean it's very I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's easier to get the person who's doing like the a restaurant in a place or a small scale something to be in conversation about this idea of doing something that focuses on the economics of the neighborhood, that they're there, right? And it's easy to have that conversation, but it's harder to get someone who's in the high rise downtown to say, hey, come and be a part of this kind of conversation. It's a bit harder. So fortunately, I've had the opportunity of getting this fellowship at the University of Chicago, the New Bar, and through there, I've been able to kind of navigate through the University of Chicago folks, and then through some of the connections of some of the people downtown, but not very many, and so it's slowly kind of massaging that and trying to figure out how to do it in a way though that is balanced and respectful, even though I know that if we don't get the some of the downtown folks involved in it, it will severely limit what's possible. But I also know that you can't just focus on the downtown folks and not the folks that are already kind of in the neighborhood doing stuff, because there's you end up kind of losing a sense of trust. So it's a kind of but I'm not gonna give names like right now, but I can talk to you about it. If you got some folks I should talk to, I'm gathering. Somebody in the back.
Last question. Wow. I guess I better make it a good one. Thank you for your presentation and your amazing work, and also just being transparent. I think about the good, bad, and the indifferent or ugliness to a work. Several years ago, I saw a conversation between you and Nato Thompson at Creative Time. Wow. And one thing that stuck out to me was, and I'm paraphrasing one of the things you said, that social practice of socially engaged art is gentrifying community-based art. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to see how that has changed over time or not changed, or maybe where you stand on that, given some of the variations in language and ways we think about those types of art forms.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, community art's been gentrified. It just has. It's, and it's not all bad. I mean, and also, well, and maybe I should go back, because my general definition of gentrification is that it's a bad thing, because gentrification is this notion that one group will push out the other without any consideration, whatever. And I don't think that the whole notion of social practice and community engaged art is dismissive of the communities that they work in. I think they do. Everybody that's doing it is trying to figure out how to do it. But it has limited, though, the presence of people that have a more traditional community-based, practice. And but for me, I think that the important thing for me is that even though there are more people who are practicing within a community in the context of social practice, and that's where the resources are kind of designated too. I mean, you get your projects and that kind of stuff mostly as social practice people or whatever, and not community-based folks. And I think that to me, what I try to do is I try to leverage my work to be able to connect with those local artists in a way that what I'm doing is kind of it has a kind of a shared kind of benefit for myself and the people that I'm working with, and it's not just my thing that I'm doing. So the thing in Tulsa is it's a I've really had to work with that idea in Tulsa because the conventional wisdom would have been, first of all, I mean, we they asked me to do it, and there was this Bloomberg $1 million public art challenge, and they said, maybe we should try for that, and they had already started thinking about it. And when I came in, I was looking at what they were proposing, and I said no, because they wanted to like bring in certain artists kind of stuff, and I was like no, I was like this issue of the Tulsa massacre is so deeply embedded in the local folks here that they need to be in this. This is an opportunity for them, to speak to this. And maybe if you do this thing, the Greenwood Art Project does something in 2021, maybe it could do something in 2023. It could become like a biennial, right? But the first one needed to be the local folks. We had to create a framework for local folks to do this, and maybe in the future you can open it up and it's national and international because lots of people want to have that conversation. But I just thought it was kind of my way of saying, let's not just gentrify this situation and bring in folks from the outside to just, the professionals. So my role in that project is I'm kind of like the coach. I'm trying to like coach this team of folks that some of them are, just, folks that have stories. They have stories they want to get out. But there are artists there that have great talents, but they don't connect with those stories. So we're trying to get these artists to help people tell stories, but it's all happening within the Tulsa scene. That's anyway. All right. Thank you. Hey. All right. Yeah. What are you studying here? Oh, okay. Oh, good. Yeah. Have fun, man. I mean, stick with it and just, do the fun stuff. Yeah.